Good morning, everybody. Today we are looking at some lessons from Isaiah chapter 24. And to be honest, the more that I studied and examined this particular chapter, the more lessons I seemed to be pulling from this particular text. And so to keep it within the time frame of the things that we've been trying to stick with in our studies, we're going to keep it moving a little bit. But I've got 3 or 4 different lessons that I want us to look at today from Isaiah chapter 24. The first one is found in verse number 2. And remember that God makes this particular declaration not against a particular nation or a particular city, but rather he says this is indicative of society on earth as a whole at that particular time. And so one of the interesting things that I found first and foremost in the chapter is the statement of verse 2. He says, "And it shall be as with the people, so with the priest, as with the servant, so with his master, as with the maid, so with her mistress, as with the buyer, so with the seller, as with the lender, so with the borrower, as with the creditor, so with the debtor." In the entirety of the society of mankind, God says, I will treat all people the same. Yes, he has his people, Israel, but at the same time, he is not a respecter of persons when it comes to justice and righteousness. And so he says, it doesn't matter who you are. I don't care whether you're a priest. I don't care whether you are just one of the average people. I don't care if you're a king, a master, a servant. I don't care. God says his standard of judgment and his standard of justice is the same for everybody. The same still holds true today, does it not? Isn't that the emphasis of passages such as Romans chapter 2 and various other places where it talks about there is no respect of persons with God? Some people like to think that that is a New Testament concept, but it's not. It's been utilized here and emphasized here in Isaiah chapter 24. The second thing I want to look at is found in verse 5. And there he says, "The earth is also defiled under its inhabitants, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore the curse has devoured the earth." The inhabitants of the earth, he says, have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, and broken the everlasting covenant. Why is it that God is mad at the people? Why is it that God is hurt? Why is it that God is bringing judgment on all of these nations and on all of these various things at various times over the next few years, next number of years? It is because they have all transgressed the laws. They have tried to change the laws. They have tried to ignore the laws, and they have broken the everlasting covenant. Folks, God doesn't care who it is. God doesn't care whether it's his people, whether it's Israel in Old Testament times or whether it's the church today. God doesn't care if it's the nations round about. He doesn't care who it is. God expects his word to be kept. God expects his laws to be upheld, his ordinances to be understood and to be held high. God will not stand for people disregarding his word. God says, these things are happening, and all of these different messages, all of these different consequences, all of these different areas have come about because all of these people have tried to change my laws and disregard my commandments. The third thing that I found in chapter 24 that I found interesting is found down at the end of the chapter in verse number 23. And that is the fact that while there are many facets of this particular chapter that we read, And we say, it sounds a lot like the New Testament statements of final judgment and all of these various things. And it does. There are a lot of parallels to the kinds of things that God says in the New Testament when it comes to the final day of judgment, and the things that he's saying now to all of these different kingdoms of the earth. But at the same time, when you get down to the last verse of Isaiah 24, we find that that is not what he's talking about. Because he says, then the moon will be disgraced and the sun ashamed, for the Lord of hosts will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem and before his elders gloriously. God has a place at this time that he reigns and that he will reign. Remember, Isaiah is going to take place before the captivity, and all of these things are going to take place before, during, and after the captivity. But even then, you're going to have the coming of the Messiah and all of these various things. And so God says, on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, I will reign gloriously. He is talking about things of that day. He is not talking about final judgment, even though there are principles and there are various things that will cause us to think of, because of what we know from the New Testament and things of that nature, will cause us to think of the final judgment, and certainly are applicable parallels to it. But that doesn't mean that that is the exact statement that is being made. The final thing, very quickly, that I want to pull from chapter 24, though not specifically from any particular verse, is really kind of an analysis of the overwhelming evidence of the chapter. And that is, God knows, or God cares about everybody. So many times we get the idea that the only people that God was truly concerned about, or that God truly interacted with, or that God truly worried about the obedience of, were the people of Israel. And that everybody else was kind of left out in the cold, and that they were the leftovers. They were the ones that God had already basically decided they were doomed to hell, and he didn't care anything about them anyway. That's just simply not true. And that is not the way that God approaches them from any of these chapters that we've read leading up to this. But God actually is concerned about, has been concerned about, and cares about the entirety of humanity. And has from the very beginning. Remember, the entire reason for going through this exercise of having a chosen people and of bringing about the Messiah and all of those things was so that mankind, not one particular nation, not one special group of people, but that mankind would have the opportunity for salvation. It was for everybody. It was always designed for everybody, not just for a special few that had been singled out as being special. Now, we have the responsibility to accept it, just as they had the responsibility to accept his laws and to be obedient to them in this day. We have the responsibility to pay attention to what he said and to utilize it properly. But if we do that, we have the promises that he gives, because he loves us, and he cares for us, and he wants us to be with him. I hope you have a good day. We will pick up tomorrow with Isaiah chapter 25.